All right. What's up, guys? I hope you're doing well. James here from jamesdforsythe.com. So this weekend I was scrolling through um, Liberty Street Economics, that blog that I sometimes do videos for economic data, and I came across this title and I was like, okay, I have to read this one, right? So we're just gonna let it speak for itself and go straight into the screen share showing it. So with that being said, hop over here. So consumer scores and price discrimination, right? So obviously when I read this title, it was like, oh, this might be worth the reading. And normally when you read something like that, I mean, you have to be keep in mind like clickbaity titles and things like that. Um, but on a blog for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, that's not really their target demographic is probably not going to be so clickbaity, right? Um, they're going to be more interested in the actual stuff themselves, like why I was even on there in the first place, right? And so basically, where they're going with this, and there was a paper that they did about this, um, with everyone knows about credit scores, right? So there's another thing that I didn't know was a thing, called customer lifetime value, right? And it's basically like another scoring system that's more private that firms use to target ads, prices, products, and services to individual customers, right? And there's also some affluence index that ranks households according to their spending power. And so basically, it, it kind of seems like there's almost like a customer profile for everyone. Maybe not on a very individual basis, but basically, how they describe it is consumer scores use data such as like age, ethnicity, gender, household income, zip code, and past purchases, and basically create a scoring system that proxies a customer's characteristics, um, and possibly even their financial behaviors, right? And so these scores are not available for consumers to actually see themselves, according to this. And basically, they're asking the question is like, should we be able to see these scores and things like that, right? So, like, what's the benefit there? And they kind of break it down into like concerns and then kind of looking into different um, I guess use cases would be a good way. So, like, say, like a naive customer, and then someone who knows what about the score can try to manipulate their own score, which is kind of like you can do with your credit score, right? Where you can change kind of your financial habits to increase it or decrease it for whatever purpose, whether that be like to get, I mean, some form of debt or whatever, right? And so, a distinguishing feature of these scores is that the data brokers that produce them also sell them to companies for market segmentation strategies. Thus, these scores do not merely affect a consumer's interaction with a single firm. The information carried by the score creates links across interactions with different firms and industries over time, right? So it's kind of like a credit score in that respect. It's not just like each individual firm kind of calculates their own. It's kind of more like it's shared between all of these people, right? And so, in a recent paper, they developed a model on score based price discrimination. uh, their model shuts down any value creation to isolate the mechanisms by which consumers can be harmed by data collection, and the focus on price discrimination stems from the increasingly granular e commerce targeting and product steering techniques that make de facto discriminatory pricing a real possibility, right? And so basically, purchases carry information about you, also just like willingness to pay, not only like, there's certain things where you can, I guess you could argue causation. Like if you're buying a certain type of medicine, odds are you have some condition that that medicine requires, right? And so when a firm can see you buy this specific medicine on a relatively consistent basis, they're like, oh, this person probably has whatever this condition is. And so they can kind of learn things about you just from what you're purchasing, right? Whether it be habits or behaviors or just conditions in general, right? But and also when you get to more non-necessities type things, it kind of shows you the more the willingness to pay for certain things. Like how much are you willing to pay for certain services, like haircuts or landscaping or whatever, right? And so it's also like they say it's positively correlated over time. So in terms of like your willingness to pay. So obviously the more throughout time, the more you buy that certain that good or service, the more willing you are to pay for it, right? You don't want to kind of go back on whatever you've done. You don't want to go from if you're used to having your hair cut every 2 weeks, you don't want to get it done every 4 months or whatever. Um, so there's that. So harms and benefits of this type of scoring. So price discrimination unambiguously harms naive consumers, um, basically defining them as people who do not recognize the links across transactions. How going to um, one firm and buying a certain amount of something will affect the pricing on an individual basis for something else, right? Going to a separate firm, right? Specifically, in the naive case, consumer welfare falls with the quality of the signals available to the firm. Firms, in turn, are better off, and that's because the price signaling of your behavior is can be rather inconsistent in the grand scheme of things. I guess that's kind of where they're trying to spin this. And so basically from there they kind of parameterize, as they say, by relevance that each score gives to past signals of behavior, so that a large weight on the past leads to a score with high persistence, right? As they say. So basically, the higher the weighting they can put on your past behavior, the more consistent that'll be with what they believe your behavior is going to be. But that also requires a certain amount of persistence and consistency on your part and your certain behaviors and so on, right? So it's kind of learning your behavior over time and what you're buying and getting kind of a predictive power from that, right? And so something I kind of raises my eyebrows because I like to be left alone in that respect, right? So, but on the other hand, you can have someone who's aware of all these things, or aware of this kind of calculation on the back end. And so, as they call them, strategic customers or consumers, they can benefit from the presence of these scores, even if firms ultimately use them against them, right? Since they can reduce the quantity, since that person can reduce the quantity demanded to manipulate her score. They kind of show like a bit of a demand curve. So basically, like you can purchase less, kind of trying to show them that you have less demand for it, and then basically they're forced to bring their prices down. Kind of um, in the same way you can view it as credit scores, to where like you don't take on as much debt or you show less demand for debt and so on, and so you kind of have to, or the more, I guess the better way would say it, the more financially frugal you can be. It seems like you get like lower interest rates and stuff, or could get lower interest rates in that respect, and you basically trying to get you to almost lower it in a way, um, so to speak. But basically, they're talking about how what this graph depicts is this red area was kind of that individual strategically lowering their demand, right, or what their perceived demand from the point of view of whatever firm. And so basically, that forces the firm to lower the price. And then basically, this blue part is supposed to be like a per unit price, um, in a way. And so basically, by them lowering the price, you're able to increase the amount of units that you can buy at that lower price, right? So kind of that sort of thing, right? And that's kind of the whole point. Or I guess that's kind of the whole, or that's kind of the way that you can strategically manipulate the score in a way, right? And so the strategic demand reduction implies that purchases are less sensitive to changes in the willingness to pay. So thus signals lose informativeness and price discrimination with scores is less effective, right? These losses cannot be eliminated if firms use scores that are best predictors in an ex post sense, that is, given the available data, strategic consumers will adjust their behavior, making the data less informative in the first place. A complex cat and mouse situation emerges, with consumers attempting to hide as firms seek to estimate their preferences, right? To kind of masking your signals in a way that it's harder for firms to like predict your behavior, and in that respect, kind of it lowers their predictive ability to discriminate with prices, right? Via prices. And so I'm not really sure on how this can be used on an individual basis in terms of like the grand scheme of goods. Like you're not going to go to Walmart and they're going to be like, "Oh, you specifically have to pay for chicken instead of this other person." However, things like insurance, um, is the first thing that comes to mind to where it is like on an individual basis, and they kind of already have this kind of modeling, so to speak, for you in general, kind of how much you have to pay in general, your premium specifically. So it's like kind of like how um, younger individuals and kids, especially, whenever they start driving or getting a car or whatever, the insurance is obnoxious relative to what it could be when you're like 40, right? Because there's no history. And it's also like, yes, the insurance is kind of pricing in their risk on how much the probability of which they have to pay out and things like that. But it's also like, it's it's looking at that concept from the other point of view, right? And so you're kind of, in a way, according to this, kind of discriminating against the younger people to where maybe you're pricing them out of getting insurance and therefore can't drive or, well, shouldn't drive legally or however you want to say it. So you basically just have a lot of kids just hopping on their parents' insurance and so on, right? Um, kind of along that respect. But I don't know. Not quite sure how good of an analogy that is, but it's just kind of what popped in my head. But anyways, so specifically, firms can mitigate their losses if they commit to persistent scores, those that give excessive importance to the past information, kind of weighing your past behavior in a respect. But the problem with that is that since it's weighted so much on the past, so basically, it's going to be much harder to move if you want to manipulate it because it is so weighted. It's kind of like the difference between, I don't know, if you look at like stock charts and stuff. So, like moving averages, when you're looking at like a 50-day moving average versus a 100-day versus a 200-day, the more days, the more it's weighted in the past, the harder it is to move it. So, 1 day variations aren't going to have much of an effect, right? In the grand scheme of the entire average, which is kind of where they're going with that, or what it seems. And so basically, therefore, scores that are more persistent than those that arise in a cat and mouse world uh, can be more profitable because they incentivize consumers to signal more of their information. Basically, because um, your scores would be so weighted in the past, in this case, you'd basically have, and again, that moving average concept to where since they're so weighted in the past, it's more difficult to move them, meaning you would have to signal more to kind of make them to manipulate them in a certain way. If you wanted to go up to a significant degree, you'd have to do much more. You'd have to behave in that way, probably more significantly, and also for a longer period of time before that actually starts to kind of get factored in and moves in a certain way. And so, with this said, to what degree does this score have to be transparent? And to take their headline, it would be critical, right? Because you can't really manipulate your score optimally, I guess would be the best way to say it, if you don't know it, right? And so, in this paper, their second contribute contribution, wow, can't talk this morning, consists of showing that the possibility of data collection benefiting consumers via lower prices relies heavily on making scores transparent. Because if you don't know it, you can't really, you don't know, right? And you kind of have to get in there and understand it to some form or to some degree before you can even try to manipulate it in a certain way, right? Otherwise, you're kind of just shotgunning in the dark, right? And so the results inform policy, surprising, consumer awareness of the potential for price discrimination and score transparency have complementary roles, and one without the other may be detrimental to welfare, right? And so, from what it seems, is like this kind of scoring is already in place to a certain degree. Um, Tried to look up the papers and stuff, but you have to. I know this one specifically for customer lifetime value is a Wall Street Journal article, but and then same with the I think the same with the affluence index. Can open it up and see. No, that's linked to Equifax. Yeah, and it's just a sales page. So I'm not going to waste your guys' time with that. But anyways, so I just kind of wanted to bring awareness to that in general. This was posted just about a month ago. Um, so something to keep in mind. I don't know how long this has already been going on. Something I've been rather ignorant to, which is probably why I clicked on it. But just wanted to share it because that's something I think, especially with some of the talk going around the margins in, like, I don't know if I'd say like the investing or kind of financial niche, whatever you want to call it, that kind of space, with social credit scores and things like that. That would kind of plays into it in a way. But at one point, it's kind of trying to distinguish, okay, is this more of like a social credit score or is it more like pricing an insurance premium? And so, like, where on that spectrum is it kind of functioning, right? And to really do that or to make that distinguishment, you'd have to kind of understand a lot more about it, which I'll start looking into. Um, See, like, how exactly do they measure it? How is it implemented? Things like that, right? But regardless, it's at least something interesting. So, with that being said, we're gonna go ahead and stop the screen share, head over here. So I'm gonna leave that one here, and yeah, I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you on the next one.